Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Waste 360's Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte. My name is Charlotte Dreisen, and I am so excited to be with you here today talking about resin identification codes, or RIC codes. And these are what people really refer to day to day as the recycling numbers. But plot twist, they do not really mean that something is recyclable. So we are going to unpack what they do mean, where you find them, why they're on packages, and really dive into all of the nitty-gritty this week. I am so interested for everyone's thoughts and comments and questions about RIC codes, so feel free to drop any into the comments below, or as always, shoot me a tweet or message about them, eager for the conversations. But let's just start from the very beginning. Resin identification codes were really intended to communicate manufacturer to manufacturer in the plastic industry what a plastic item was made of. They aren't limited to plastic packaging. You can see them on plastic items of every shape and form. You can also see them outside of the US where different numbering systems exist. So we're really going to be focusing on the numbering systems that you see here in the US and in North America today. But once they were started in 1988 by industry, they really exploded. And today there are requirements on the books for a number of states, 39 out of the 50 states plus DC. Never want to forget about DC. For RIC codes to be on plastic packaging in some way, shape, or form. For some kinds, maybe not others. It is a really complicated, complex landscape. It is something that's really hard for manufacturers to navigate. You know, why North Carolina might need one kind of RIC code, but not another state. They're a big one, but it is really challenging to keep track of. So with that changing, really complicated landscape, a lot of manufacturers decide we are just going to put resin identification codes on all of our plastic items that we produce to try and simplify the process, which is definitely understandable, especially when the landscape is so fractured and complicated. But a consequence of that has been that consumers like you and me have all started to really conflate what can be recycled with that number. And they do have something to do with recyclability. They communicate what a base plastic is made of, which may from the get-go rule out something and mean from the get-go it's not recyclable. But it doesn't necessarily mean that something is recyclable either. It really is intended to convey just the material, the base plastic that an item is made of. So for that reason, it's really challenging for consumers to break out of that framework and understand that not all packaging that has a number one, like a soda bottle, means that it's also recyclable like a soda bottle. You can take a good plastic and do stuff to it to make it go bad, to make it go unrecyclable, become unrecyclable. You could put crazy labels on it. You could put colorants and dyes and adhesives on it that make it unrecyclable. So resin identification codes were never intended to communicate recyclability, don't really have anything to do with recyclability, but because it's the best proxy that we have today for communicating and differentiating one kind of plastic from another, that's kind of how we've gotten to where we are. We're not only companies using it as a shorthand for communicating recyclability when it doesn't really mean that's the case, but communities and governments and cities and states do it too. So everyone kind of defaults to resin identification codes, to RIC codes as a shorthand, but it's pretty challenging to do that because it's just not a hard and fast rule. So what are the resin identification codes themselves? We're going to go through one by one at a high level, and then we'll dive a bit more deeply into each of them. So you likely have seen many of them on the bottom of plastic containers. You might not be familiar with all of them or what they all mean. The number 7 is a bit of a plot twist. But starting at the top at number 1, Number 1, plastics are polyethylene terephthalate, or PET plastic. They are soda bottles, what soda bottles are made of. They're really high value plastic. There's great markets for them, mostly when they're clear and transparent, or clear and green, like a Perrier bottle, or clear and blue, like a Dasani bottle. Dasani bottles, actually, that tint of blue that they have, actually act as optical brighteners to really lighten and brighten yellowed, recycled loads of plastic, because the more you recycle PET and plastic, the more yellowed and hazy it becomes. That tint of blue actually brightens it and makes it a little bit more white to the eye. which is kind of cool. Very high value though, same with number 2, Ldpe. So high density polyethylene is our number 2 resin identification code. Very valuable. Many communities separate 2 bales of Ldpe. So not only do they sort out Ldpe to sell on the recycling marketplace, they sort out natural Ldpe as well as colored Ldpe, because by distinguishing that, you can better kind of identify end markets and people who want to buy that back and put it into new products. So your kind of iconic example of an Hdpe item is a milk jug. That's what they're all made of. Number 3 is polyvinyl chloride, PVC, which you might be familiar with for some packaging applications, but it's not most commonly found in packaging. A lot of people might be familiar with PVC having some harmful human health impacts, which is true when they use plasticizers in it. So it's not the plastic itself, it's the plasticizers that are used in a lot of those applications to make it softer. But it's something that you might have been familiar with, might have heard somewhere along the line. You might be more familiar with PVC in PVC pipes or siding or flooring, for instance. But the best packaging example that I always think of is what duvet covers come in. So that kind of really soft, shiny, flexible plastic that you might buy a comforter in, that's usually PVC packaging. And that's not recyclable. No value in the recycling market really in terms of curbside recycling systems. You could set up some dedicated channels, and there are some dedicated channels for stuff like hospital packaging and hospital healthcare products that use PVC a lot to be recycled, but in the curbside recycling system isn't something that we can really accept and accommodate in the US. Number 4, our 4th resin identification code is low density polyethylene, or Ldpe. So number 2 is Hdpe, number 4 is Ldpe. They're the same kind of plastic formulated differently. Ldpe you do see in some rigid applications and some hard plastics, but you also mostly see it and think of it most often for films and bags. So plastic films and bags like a takeout bag or a cereal bag or bubble wrap, that's all low density polyethylene. High value, but it needs to be collected when it's in that flexible format through the dedicated store drop-off stream. You wouldn't be able to put a low density polyethylene bag in your curbside bin for recycling, because as we know, flexible plastic films cannot be recycled curbside, unfortunately, but something like a rigid Ldpe container would be recycled no problem in most systems. Number 5, our 5th resin identification code plastic is polypropylene, a really high value plastic. In recent years, some communities have not been able to accept and process it, but it is still very common in many, if not most, recycling programs in the US. Your kind of iconic PP polypropylene container is a yogurt cup. So that's always kind of one you can keep in mind that most of us have in our fridge in some way, shape, or form, or elsewhere in your house. Number 6 is polystyrene, and we use the number 6 for both rigid polystyrene, like what you might have on a coffee cup lid, or expanded foam polystyrene, like you might have for packing peanuts, or a foam cooler or a foam egg carton. And a lot of communities like DC have banned foam polystyrene for a lot of applications because it is really hard to recycle. You have to really suck all the air out of it to make it economical to transport. Rigid polystyrene is very low value too, but is accepted in some communities for recycling. Number 7, though, onto that wild card, is really a catch-all for everything else, which is kind of crazy. So a lot of people think, they hear a city saying we can accept 1 through 7s, give us all your plastics for recycling. No, number 7 plastic is recyclable curbside, though. It's really a misnomer when people say we can recycle all plastics 1 through 7s, because anything with a number 7 resin identification code is inherently unrecyclable in our curbside system. None of them can be taken. There are some exceptions of items that are number 7s that could be hypothetically recycled if we did collect them, and if they were in big enough, high enough volumes in the recycling system, we could probably develop the sorting capacity to sort some of them and recycle them. But today, no number 7 can be accepted in a curbside recycling program. So what is a number 7 exactly? It can be anything from an acrylic CD case that is not recyclable in a curbside system, despite somehow that emerging as a really common recyclable question. And a number 7 could also be a PLA, a compostable plastic that, we can't accept in curbside recycling programs. We talked a lot about compostable plastic and PLA in our last episode last week. Really encourage you to take a listen there if you'd like to learn more. But that's a number 7 resin identification code plastic. Doesn't mean it's recyclable just because it has that number on it. In fact, it means it's not recyclable. Number 7 plastics also can be plastics that have mixed polymers. So industry sometimes uses a number 7 when it might be combining, say, a number 2 and number 4, or a number 2 and number 1, or any combination thereof. Often industry will use a number 7 if they have mixed polymers. So that's something to keep in mind, but essentially important to know that if you have a number 7 container, cup, container, clamshell, you name it, don't put it into a recycling bin, is the moral of the story. And these resin identification code numbers can be updated. The ASTM, the group that really rules over and governs these standards for resin identification codes, iteratively really think through, is this the best way that we can categorize and format plastic packaging types? Anyone can join ASTM, so if you are really into this topic and want to nerd out and listen to long conference calls about the nitty-gritty details of resin identification codes, of RIC codes, you can join ASTM for like 50, 75 bucks and start voting on whenever those kind of amendments come up on the table for change. But a breakdown there of kind of what each resin identification code means. So zooming out, just to summarize, number 1's like soda bottles, number 2 like milk jugs, some number 4's, the hard ones, and number 5's are really the high value plastics that most curbside recycling programs can accept. You always want to double check. Of course, most communities though can really always take number 1's and number 2's, our PET bottles and our HDPE bottles, and then it kind of varies from there. Usually one of the big constraints with whether a community can accept other plastics beyond those number 1's and 2's that are really high value is how many optical sorters they can afford at their recycling facility. So we talked a little bit about this in our plastic episode, our second episode, but recycling facilities sort plastic by using what we called NIR sorters, near infrared sorters, and they basically shoot a beam of light down at the conveyor belt filled with plastic packaging, and they either positively or negatively sort out a plastic item based on the kind of resin that the reader, the sorter, looks at the packaging and sees that it's made of. So if a near infrared optical sorter shoots down the light beam, sees that something is a PET bottle and it's designed to pull out only PET bottles, it'll kind of yank all of those out and separate them into their own streams so they can be baled and sold onto the recycling market. Usually these machines are either, intended to grab one item or eject one kind of item. So one optical sorter can't do it all. So if you can only afford, they're really expensive, they can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you can only afford a couple, you're going to design them so they're pulling out number 1's and number 2's, because that's the majority of your stream. Those are really high value plastics that we have a lot of that people are pretty good at recycling. If you can afford a third, you might start pulling out number 5's, polypropylenes, or the rest of that category. So we in the business call this a 3 through 7 bale. So that would technically include anything from polyvinyl chloride, that PVC number 3, to number 4 Ldpe, to number 5 polypropylene, to number 6 polystyrene, and number 7's and their kind of Wild West cards. So when we talk about that entire bale of 3 through 7's being collected, it technically means it might be any of those items, but a lot of communities like DC, for instance, we collect 3 through 7 bales at our recycling facility, but we only accept in our recycling program polypropylene and polystyrene. We don't accept PVC and number 7 plastics. So even though the recycling facility might not be able to have 5 or 6 optical sorters to pick out each one of those number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7 separately, we do collect that kind of universe of everything that's left over, and we send it off to another facility to sort out kind of in a secondary stage. Other communities might not be able to afford really any optical sorters and might not be able to distinguish one plastic from another. So they might collect bales of everything 1 through 7. They might not take out the soda bottles separately from the milk jugs, separately from everything else. And unfortunately, one of the impacts of that is that they can't get as much money on the recycling market for that mixed bale because someone down the line is going to have to pay for the rest of it to be sorted. But there are a lot of different ways that communities do that, which is really exciting. As we have also talked about before in the past, this means that shrink sleeves for plastic bottles can be really confusing for machinery. So I always see this for like muscle milk or chocolate milk for whatever reason. I guess not for whatever reason, that shrink sleeve that's over the plastic bottle, that's a normal PET, high quality PET bottle, is another kind of plastic to provide a light barrier so the milk inside doesn't spoil. But unfortunately, if you recycle that bottle with that full body shrink sleeve over it without taking it off, the near infrared optical sorter is going to bounce that light beam back onto the bottle and just see what the shrink sleeve is made of, not what the plastic underneath is made of. So that's something to be mindful of when you're thinking about, what kind of plastic is this container that I'm holding. You really need to be, sure that the base material underneath can be exposed to the sorter at a recycling facility. There's a lot of exciting innovation and R&D happening in the packaging space to give better label options for people to use that would match the label to the container underneath, and also enable those labels to be freed from the bottle when they're recycled. So one of the big problems today in recycling plastic containers is that we want to keep them really kind of crisp, clear materials. So, a plastic clear water bottle, that, is really a high quality recycled plastic item. A dark, opaque PET bottle isn't going to be as high value because it's harder to put that back into other products. If I make water bottles, I don't want to buy dark colored opaque plastic to put back into my perfect clear recyclable water bottle. I want the really clear, bright, translucent plastic. So when you have labels that might have branding and company names and nutritional information on them, you want to make sure that the label in the recycling process can like perfectly freely peel off of the plastic bottle. That's not always easy to do though. So depending on the adhesive you use and the kind of label it is, it might stay stuck to that plastic and then unfortunately dye and contaminate the color of the plastic that's being recycled. So in a perfect world, we really want to be using label materials and adhesives that are designed for the recycling process so they can kind of eject themselves from the plastic container being recycled and not harm the plastic underneath. Those are a number of considerations about the kind of recycling symbols, the resin identification codes that are used on plastic packaging today. I'm going to end with one of the most common questions that I get on Twitter about resin identification codes, or not necessarily about them themselves, but that really is the core of the question. One of the most common questions I get is, I have this item, here's a picture of it, it doesn't have a RIC code, what should I do with it? And just like how having a RIC code doesn't necessarily mean something is recyclable, having no RIC code either doesn't necessarily mean it's not recyclable. It might just be a product that's manufactured in one of those states that doesn't require a RIC code. And a lot of companies and efforts are out there to give more precise, better, higher quality recycling messaging that actually tells a consumer, tells someone if something can be recycled or not. A resin identification code, a lot of companies are starting to understand, doesn't do the trick. That's not clear enough messaging. And of course, we know that you can take something with a resin identification code for a high value plastic, like let's say #1 PET, and do something to it with a label or a spray trigger, like a cleaning product bottle where it has like a little nozzle, spray nozzle. Those have metal components in it. So even though the package says #1, I'm made of PET, I'm a high value, high quality plastic, that entire package might not be recyclable until you remove that spray trigger with a metal spring, metal component, so it doesn't contaminate the plastic. So for those reasons, a lot of companies are shifting away for other, better, more accurate, precise labeling mechanisms instead of using just resin identification codes like we have relied on for the past few decades, which is really exciting to see and see better, more accurate labeling messaging out there. But it is really interesting to often see that sometimes resin identification codes are just straight up wrong. You might see a plastic container that once you kind of develop an understanding for what kinds of plastics are used in which applications, you might be able to call out that, that's saying it's a number 1 plastic, and I know that's not made of number 1. So we also know that there are some errors out there and that we can't always trust a resin identification code on a package for that reason when we do see one. So that is definitely a really common question I get, but I am so eager and interested to better understand what questions you have. Please don't hesitate to give me a shout, ask a question, drop me a line at Twitter at Chardreizen, Chardreizen. Right below the video as well, feel free to drop comments, questions. I am so excited to see what you think, how you thought about resin identification codes in the past, what you think a better system would be, if you've seen any crazy examples of RIC codes being used, because there are such crazy funny ones out there. And of course, always feel free to give me a shout on Instagram as well at Recyclable. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Waste 360's Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte. It has been such a pleasure to nerd out about RIC codes with you today. I'm looking forward to the next episode.